And our last consideration before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of these vital points is the idea of angle and penetration, for lack of a better term. If you look at a lot of these modern pressure point masters, whether it's in the law enforcement community or the more traditional sort of martial community, you'll oftentimes see very, very particular instructions giving to the angle, the depth of penetration, and so on. And these are important considerations, but we gotta be really careful that we're not approaching them like some kind of an algebra lesson. If we look back to some of the oldest pressure point systems, like Varmakalai, for example, in India, we definitely see some consideration from angle of attack and depth of penetration, surface hits versus deep hits. There are some points that can be affected by rubbing, there are others by tapping, there are some that require grinding, and there are some that require very, very deep impact. And I spent a good amount of time living in India for work over the course of many years. During that time I had the opportunity to train both in Kalari Payat, which is a very traditional Indian system, and Gushti, which is a more traditional but a more sportive wrestling system. And in both of those systems we see huge consideration of biomechanics and anatomy, of vital point strikes, and this idea of angle and penetration. Even in Gushti, which is a wrestling system that doesn't have hits per se, there was consideration given to grabbing the nape of the neck versus slapping the nape of the neck versus hanging on the nape of the neck, and brushing with an elbow versus grinding with an elbow or driving with an elbow. So there was very much a consideration to how to get into a target, even if it's just to deplete someone's energy, how long to stay there, and how to drive on what angle. When we get into styles like Chinese Kung Fu, for example, we get this introduction of the idea of fajing, or of explosive animal power. And this has two real elements that we see carried through all the Japanese martial arts right up into law enforcement training. And the first is the idea of activation, what's sometimes called a live hand or an activated hand. And the idea here is that the body should be invigorated, it should be activated. When I was teaching Chinese Kung Fu, the idea was that the space between the legs and under the armpits should be kind of inflated, and there was always an extension into the tendons, into the sort of substructure of the body. We were never proceeding from a completely flaccid position and then suddenly becoming tense. There was always some level of activation. But we do see in other martial arts a contrary view, which is the idea that the hand should only be contracted at the moment of impact. And philosophically this sounds beautiful. The ideal sounds amazing. I stay totally loose and then I contract at the moment of impact. But I'm a big opponent of this idea for a lot of reasons. The first is that under conditions of stress, things get tight, and we can have as much ideological allegiance to relaxation as a concept. Relaxation is not a bad word, guys. We need some degree of activation to stay standing, to stay strong, to keep everything together in our body. And so the idea that I'm always going to have just enough time to perfectly contract at the moment of impact, well, that's something of a dojo idea. That's something of an idea that works when you're working against something that's not moving. Even a punching bag that is swinging, if I have perfect timing and I'm working and everything's under controllable circumstances, it's all right. But the minute I get a bad spin on the bag or I hit badly, the bag comes in a little bit quicker than I thought. I may not have time to contract in time, and then I hurt my wrist or my fist. So when we have a dynamic opponent that's animate and moving with aggression and intent, that becomes even more probable. So I'm not really a fan of this idea at all. And we see in the Chinese martial arts very often there'll be like an activation of a finger, or the hands will be flared a certain way. We see it in traditional jiu-jitsu, the so-called live hand. It's very, very apparent in Aikido. They'll always begin with that activation. It's not to say the hand is tense, but the hand is ready. It's activated and it's engaged. And then at the moment of impact, there's a greater pulse of contraction. So yes, it is true that you can contract at the moment of impact, but no, we should not begin completely loose and flaccid and start to work on this like exaggerated philosophical whip, because it could put our joints in danger, our body in danger. So we always want to be ready. In something like Irish boxing, which is bare knuckle, the hands are always ready, because if we're too loose at the beginning, it leaves us prone to getting hit and broken. And when we're working bare knuckle, there's no protection, there's no tape, there's no pads. Our hands have to always be ready in case a head comes in faster than we thought it would. In something like Chinese China, they were always talking about activating the hands so that we wouldn't be prone to finger grabs. If we look at arts like judo, the hands are always dynamic and ready as we're snatching and grabbing at the other person's gi. We're always ready. On the mat, we're contracting our fingers or going into a leopard fist so we're not as prone to getting broken. We're never really truly relaxed and flaccid. We're always protected. So the idea of relaxation is a relative one. It's relative to context. When you're in a state of aggression, when you're in danger, there should be an alert in the body. There should be an activation. When we get to things like impact, then we have the idea of transmitting that shock wave into the target. And this is something present in all of the pressure point martial arts. This idea that a surface hit is quite different from a deep penetrating hit, and that the greater the depth and the longer the strike sort of dwells on the target, the greater the transmission of power. It was most famously popularized in the pressure point community when Bruce Siddle, a law enforcement trainer in the 70s, created PPCT, which was the first law enforcement pressure point system. It spawned PPPS from George Sylvain, which was a simplified Canadian variant. And there are many variations around the world, certainly a huge influence in law enforcement training. Siddle famously promoted this idea of what he termed a fluid shock wave, which is the idea that the body is mostly water, and then when we hit it, if we conduct our energy correctly, we send ripples through the body. The longer the hit or the tool spends time on the target, the greater the transmission of power. And he promoted somewhere between a half to 3/4 of a second to really stamp that power in. It's akin to a fleeting shot is like skipping a stone across the water, whereas a strike with time on target would be like taking that same pebble and then slam dunking it into the water to make a bigger splash, more ripples that last longer. And so the idea was that the longer the strike can stay on the target, the greater the effect it could potentially have. But people massively misinterpret this. And if we're doing a non-resistant demo, it's very easy for me to hit and stay frozen and for the person to really go, oh, and feel the difference. If I strike your radial nerve with a fleeting glancing shot versus a protracted shot that kind of stays there, then people will say, wow, time on target really works. And it does from a biomechanical level. But not all points are created equally. So just going forward, I want you to consider that if we take something like some of the knockout points we're going to look at in the chin, well, there's really no advantage in doing a slow pushing strike that pushes the head slowly. What I want is a quick snapping strike that's going to cause the head to move rapidly, the brain to displace rapidly, and the nervous system to overload. So time on target on the chin would not be advisable. Time on target on the chin might work if I'm like palm striking your chin and driving you back, but it's not going to be great for activating that vital point and getting a knockout. By comparison, something like let's say the jugular notch right here above the sternum and the clavicle. If I poke in there for half a second, I'm going to get a flinch response and a gag. Obviously, if I could have more time on target and spend like a half second in there, it could be much more injurious and have a greater effect. But is it realistic? Is it probable? Even if I have the back of your head anchored and I drive in there, your subject is going to respond with all of the power of their nervous system, flinching, moving back, and gagging. And the likelihood that I'm ever going to have good time on target there is really very low. So there's not a lot of value in training for it when I know that the minute I'm going to get it, I'm going to get a push away. Just not likely. By comparison, the suprascapular and the trapezius are a strike that if I hit sort of on the surface, it can still cause great effect. And if I have somebody choking my buddy and I walk up and double hammer fist them on the suprascapulars, as we'll see, can have huge effect. Is it amplified by time on target? Well, that point absolutely is. If I can kind of hit and hang there for half a second, it sends this resonance right down to the heels and makes people kind of collapse. So that's absolutely better with time on target. Is it probable? Well, in an intervention like that where I'm coming up from behind and I'm ambushing you, it's very likely that I could get good time on target. So as we'll see, some points benefit from that explosive kind of fetching, that explosive delivery of power on the surface, because that's what's likely to happen. And if you try to do more, the reflex and the response that you're triggering won't permit it. Some are absolutely amplified by time on target, but just not realistically ever going to happen because of how the person responds. And then others are more likely to be benefited and more likely to occur. So we're going to be looking at probability, not just what feels cool during training. In all the cases, they all benefit from a readiness in the arms. Tony Blauer, in his teaching of the spear or the The brachial stun famously talks about having the hands activated all the time and then further activating them on impact. And that's a really good example of a modern combative system adhering to time-tested and proven principles from traditional combat. It's quite different from philosophical ideas that just don't translate in the real world. So we're always going to be looking at our delivery system, but we're also always going to be talking about activation of the hands and how to get ourselves as ready as possible to hit. Even in something like a conversation stance like I'm doing now, I can have my hands open but activated, moving, ready, not just passively turning into myself and completely flaccid, where my engagement from one end of the spectrum to full activation at the other is less likely and more difficult to engage.